It'll be tough one.
I know. I have no clue about this university, and I may be supposed to answer things. That's a bag also. I can take my bag. Thank you.
From here,
Yeah, just put any map of South China Sea, so that they will.
The Spratly Islands, etc.
any South.
I think you're all lying here, so you could just Google map South China Sea and just put.
The first one is the leaf boxes, that colorful one with red, purple, yellow.
So now to remove this to download the map.
Yes, you have to change it to put the map on.
A very good morning to all present here. On behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, it is my privilege to deliver the welcome address. Today we have 4 esteemed guests to discuss their perspectives on the issue of ASEAN and China on South China Sea dispute. We have with us Dr. Swaran Singh. Dr. Singh is a professor for diplomacy and disarmament at Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has 25 years of experience in research and teaching. He has given lectures at several institutions including the National Defence College, Defence Service Staff College, Foreign Services Institute, and the Indian Institute for Public Administration. He also contributes to radio and television discussions. We welcome you, sir.
So should we? Thank you.
Our second panelist is Mr. Abhijit Singh, Senior Fellow at Head of the Maritime Policy Initiative, Observer Research Foundation. He's a maritime professional with specialist and command experience in frontline Indian naval ships. He's a keen commentator on maritime matters and has written extensively on security and governance issues in the Indian Ocean and Pacific littorals.
Thank you.
We welcome you, sir. We have with us Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh, Senior Research Associate and Coordinator for Southeast Asia and Ocean Center at the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, Delhi. Dr. Singh has participated in Track 2 and 1.5 dialogues with Myanmar, New Zealand and Australia. He has published on the role of military in Southeast Asia, India-Vietnam strategic relations, India's Look East policy and Anti policy, and India's strategic engagement with Southeast Asia at multilateral levels. We welcome you, sir. Our final panelist is Captain Sarabjit Singh Parmar, Senior Fellow, National Maritime Foundation. He is a naval aviator who has been in the realm of maritime security, strategy, doctrine and concepts for more than a decade. As directing staff at the Indian Defence Services Staff College, he headed the National Strategy and International Law modules. As director in the Directorate of Strategic Concepts and Transformation at Naval Headquarters, he was part of the core team which revised Indian Navy's unclassified maritime security strategy, document and doctrine. We welcome you, sir. There's a slight change in the format for the event. Our first panelist would be Dr. Swaran Singh, as he has to leave a little early. His remarks will be followed by a small session of question and answers with him. The rest of the event will proceed as per the agenda that was circulated. I now hand over the session to our chair, Dr. Negisha Kibbe, Associate Professor and Executive Director for the Center, to commence the panel discussion.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much, Soumya. And as a director of Center for Southeast Asian Studies, I also would like to welcome personally to our guest speakers and also the audience who are here today. Each speaker will be given 20 minutes. Then, as the welcome address said, there will be a quick first round of Q&A session after the first speaker, because he has to leave early. For those of us who follow very closely what's happening in the South China Sea, in fact, it's a very timely and very important time to organize this kind of event. But unfortunately, if we look at academic calendar, there are many students who have to do their final submissions, prepare for their final exam. That's why we could not have a larger audience. But today we are going to do recording, video and still camera as well. And also it's a live streaming, and we'll try to upload all these sessions in YouTube, maybe a day or two from now, so that people can watch from their home anytime. And I'm also inviting some of my friends around the world to follow us online today. Directly, they are following us as we speak. Of course, there are several important issues about South China Sea. Currently, I'm teaching a course on South China Sea disputes, and I'm having some of my students are here, and they'll be asking questions as well. And of course, as we all know, why South China is very complicated. It's largely, I mean, there are several reasons. One reason being it's overlapping claim areas. And of course, there's a great power rivalry between America and China. And also because of the resources, there are several other issues. And we are expecting our speakers to dwell on all those several issues. And they have been given a specific topic. And I want all the audience to listen very carefully and have a very well-prepared question so that you can ask those questions during the Q&A session. And we'll be limiting only about 3 questions for the first round of the Q&A session for Professor Swaran Singh. And now the floor is for Dr. Swaran Singh, 20 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Kipling. Thank you, Sonia, for introducing me. That introduction looks a bit dated. That makes me feel younger. So I'm extremely happy to be here in your beautiful campus. I come from, as Cambridge Oxford talks about, the other university, which is a public university. So we have our strengths and you have yours. The first visit is very delighting experience to be here. Thank you also to Abhijit for accommodating, and Kipgan also accommodating, because it's not usual that professors are supposed to be busy, but it seems that today we have a meeting that I cannot escape. So given my fear of my first visit and distance, I will try to leave by maybe 12 or a little before 12. So thank you. The subject for discussion, as Professor said, is extremely topical, extremely interesting and of great relevance to scholars in India and scholars in Asia. And I will just like to draw your attention to why are we talking and discussing this today. Why should we spend our time and focus on South China Sea? That's why I requested them to put the map for all of us to see when I speak. The size of this maritime territory is about the size of Western Europe. So depending on how the littoral nations of South China Sea grow in coming years, or how they have been growing in these years, last few decades, this could be an extremely significant part of the planet, influencing trends and trajectories, not just in this region, but beyond this region. Second, very closely, the understanding that all of us have, human activities in any case are moving from continents to oceans. Increasingly, we are becoming dependent, and there's a buzzword now about blue economy for leisure, for resources, for transportation, for everything that we need oceans. In fact, sometimes we joke that if humans had known their planet better, they would have named it water instead of earth. So human activities are expanding and becoming maritime increasingly, is why maritime spaces will be of tremendous importance in coming years. Now, this maritime territory is especially interesting because enormous amount of energy trade that happens from, if you notice, the western part, the Middle East, to East Asia, which is the driver of rapid development in East Asia, makes these part of maritime areas extremely critical for continuous development and therefore even for security of all these countries that we are talking of here. And center of this new Zeitgeist, as a German would say, is China, which is an example of how a nation can really turn around and transform itself using sheer economic prowess. We talk about rise of China, but I always underline it's only in the limited bandwidth of economic growth rates that China is rising. There's so much more yet left. You must have heard recently, Amir Khan is the superstar in China. So in terms of Bollywood, the soft power that India carries, Chinese are nowhere close to that. Last year, the foreign movie to gross highest amount, 1.8 trillion yuan, was Dangal. So remember, it's a limited bandwidth of economic growth rates which makes China really buzzing. And that is happening to several other tiger economies, as they were called, from Southeast Asia, and now India is another country on the rise with 7+ % growth rates of, again, 1 billion population. So this region itself is becoming important. What 20th century saw in cross-Atlantic as leading trends for rest of the global politics, assumption is then Asia Pacific, and now we talk of Indo-Pacific because of drift to maritime, potentially becoming really critical area to determine global affairs. And at center of Indo-Pacific is South China Sea. So significance of what we are talking about need not be expressed beyond this point. Now, second issue which makes it very critical is that it is not just potentially the most critical area to determine global trends, but it's also one of the most contentious. We all talk about artificial islands being built by Chinese, but they're not alone. Everyone who can is doing it, except the Chinese can do much better, much bigger, much faster. So therefore, China becomes the focus of this whole island, artificial island construction, which different reportage will tell you is turning into either radar centers or ports or even military bases, rehabilitation staging points. There are multiple interpretations, but Chinese presence is really very critical, and several assessments, and one could go into details of various institutions coming to more or less say that China is now in almost full control of South China Sea. That is a de facto reality. Now, de jure again, in 1948, Chinese had published a map. In India, China, we talk about 1958 map that demonstrated the border with India. This South China Sea map in 1948 from China created a 9-dash line, initially 11, but then 9-dash line, which covers about 90% of this space that we are discussing, which can be as far as 2,000 kilometers from Chinese coast and as close as few hundred meters or few hundred kilometers from the other littoral states. So literally knocking at door of littoral states around South China Sea is 90% claim of China. And China now having become really powerful, and all of you are reading about Xi Jinping emerging as the next emperor, which is a bit of an exaggeration, makes it likely that they would now like to reclaim what they thought is theirs, because they have now the capacity to do that. And they apparently have no patience for long drawn negotiations. And therefore, muscle flexing and unilateral claiming is something that we are noticing, which makes this region very edgy, if not on the brinkmanship as of now. It's anxiety prone at least. We have another, some people don't believe it's a country, called Taiwan. Now, given the fact that Chinese claims to South China Sea, 90% of it are based on two things: discovery and historical usage. In no man's land, anyone who reached first, anchored his boat, owns that territory. So Chinese claim that they were the first ones to discover and anchor and utilize several of these features, which are around 200 of them together. They are small islands, they are reefs, shoals, just rocks. In fact, that makes it very uncomfortable sea as well, because navigation, those in the forces would have better idea. Navigation requires clean oceans and clean coastlines. And in that sense, it's infested with about 200 features, let's call it general features, instead of naming each of them separately. So Chinese are claiming almost all of these. And they have the capacity, as I mentioned, to really muscle flex on these things. Now, drawing from there, the second claimant I was mentioning, the country or not to be the country, is Taiwan, has similar claims, because they still believe that they are really mainland China. Some of them still believe that, though that issue is almost getting over and dead. But they are claimants as well, and they own some of these features and islands. In fact, they have post offices on one of them. Then you have the other two major countries, the Philippines and Vietnam. Philippines and Vietnam own or control nothing in the northern part. If we had a slightly bigger map of, or more detailed map, you would see there are two sets of islands that we are talking about, Paracels and Spratlys in south. So in 1978 was the last conflict Chinese had with Vietnam, and they control entire Paracels. They have a beautiful tarmac place there. And now they are making similar tarmacs in Spratlys. So in the southern part, where Spratlys are there, Vietnam and Philippines control a couple of these island territories, and they claim on some more which are disputed. And I think Philippines was the most innovative way of doing something, which is where one goes back to China-Philippines conflict. In late 1990s sometime, in a particular little called Second Thomas Shoal, they intentionally grounded one of their civilian ships. And then that has become a baseline for them to really place their personnel on it. And that is where the China-Philippines story begins, which comes much later. There are several other skirmishes that happen. So big two nations that are contentious claimants are Vietnam on the west and Philippines on the east. They are constantly in contestations with China. Then you have on the south Malaysia, which also claims some of these territories, but they broadly believe that whatever falls in their EEZ, which is exclusive economic zone, they would claim that, and they don't carry their claims beyond EEZ. And Brunei is another small but very rich Islamic state there, which owns nothing as of now, but has claims on some of them. But story doesn't end here with the littoral states contesting. If China is on the great rise, China is becoming most important player. There are counter players which are equally strong. For example, United States. United States sees itself as the most preponderant, most powerful resident power in this region. In fact, lately we are hearing that now China is engaging Japan and India to somehow make Asian powers autonomous of United States because of our all darling Trump, the way he is handling these affairs. But as a policy, the United States policy still is to engage South China Sea, and they keep repeatedly patrolling these areas, coming as close as 12, 11 nautical miles to these artificial islands in the name of principle of freedom of navigation and freedom of aviation. But they are present. In fact, one of our friends, C. Raja Mohan, had coined a very interesting phrase to say United States is everybody's neighbor. So United States is everywhere. Now, United States has two important allies, United Kingdom and Australia. United Kingdom has sporadically shown interest in patrolling in that region, but Australia has lately become more and more reluctant. Now there are, US Marines now posted in Perth, in North. But Australia is becoming increasingly dependent economically. So for them, the largest trading partner, China, is important enough. And if you notice their defense white papers over years, the language has changed in case of Australia over a period of time. Then comes India, which is another interesting player in the region. In our case, we have shown off again and on again interest in South China Sea. which goes back to, I think we were talking in the morning of George Fernandez, who was the first defense minister to talk about India's strategic space, moves from Persian Gulf to South China Sea. The word South China Sea in official parlance was brought by him. But then the more recent, I will not detail the rest of the details, but more recent was the joint statement that Prime Minister Modi signed in January of 2015 with Obama, strategic vision for Indian Ocean and Asia Pacific, which again talked of ensuring stability and security in South China Sea, etc. So several extra regional actors also, and India is one among them, which is getting excited about this territory called South China Sea, is what makes it equally interesting for us to study, not only because of its positive relevance, but also contestations that are occurring there and enormous rise of China. And therefore, Chinese version is going to become far more influential in the future, is the concern. Why are so many nations worried about it? In this region, why are they claiming it? Why so much interest on this? Other than the sea lanes of communication that I mentioned, where about 50,000 tankers crisscross every year, there are a lot of other resources. I mentioned the blue economy. There are enormous amount of other resources which are available in this region. And estimates vary, for example, saying that about 12% of the world's fisheries, about 10 million tons every year, could be harnessed from this region. And you remember, food is an interesting issue for future. Food security is very important for future. And some of these nations where economic growth is really faster, consumption levels really going on, improving, expanding, dependence on ocean for food is going to increase over a period of time. But other than food, prosperity also raises demand for energy. And in terms of energy, again, not only oil tankers, as I mentioned, or coal or ore which is passing through this region, but it's also a region which has enormous amount of both oil and gas. And different estimates again vary, talking about 11 billion barrels of reserves in the South China Sea around Stratless, and about 190 trillion cubic feet of gas available in this. So enormous resources being available in the region, and of course the infested increasing traffic of foreign trade, especially of energy tankers, is what is making everybody really make sure they have a finger in the pie and they don't lose in the game just by China bullying around all the time. Now, I will now come very quickly for next couple of minutes on the arbitration part of it, because there was hope that that could set a certain standard for China to behave. Because China is the most important game changer in this case, and if an arbitration comes, it could create some kind of code of conduct. And that arbitration was based on provisions of UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on Law of Seas, which is described as a constitution for open oceans. It is signed by about 157 nations, effective from 1984. So it's like we all follow Constitution of India when we live here. UNCLOS is believed to be the constitution for open oceans, and all nations have to abide by it. Particularly, it has 4 kinds of dispute settlement provisions which are already listed in UNCLOS, and it talks about 4 ways of resolving issues. One is that they could go to international tribunal for set up by Law of Seas convention itself. They could also go to International Court of Justice. But interesting it is that there is a building called Peace Palace in Geneva, which hosts the arbitration, permanent arbitration court, and also the International Court of Justice is right there. Of course, there's also law school there if some of you belong to law school here. And they could also then create a special arbitration tribunal for this purpose. So UNCLOS has clear provisions in terms of dispute, how that needs to be resolved. And under that, President Aquino of Philippines had taken, after a lot of skirmishes in later part of the first decade of 21st century, in 2013 she had taken that case to Permanent Court of Arbitration.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Thank you. That I was worried I have less time. So she had taken the case to this permanent code of arbitration. They had made 15 submissions on various issues against Chinese. Now, Chinese never participated, never accepted the jurisdiction of permanent code of arbitration, and they go back to say that while signing, they had already submitted an article of reservation that arbitration conclusions of UNCLOS will not be mandatory for Chinese and they will not really be implemented. So it's not only when the case came that they were abstaining from it, they were avoiding entertaining this case, but they had said that much earlier. So they literally did not attend any of the proceedings, did not submit any papers, did not do any responding. And finally in 2016, in July, one-sided arbitration was delivered. And of course, one-sided arbitration clearly accepted all the 15 submissions and found that sovereignty and claims of Philippines were valid. And it also revoked, very interestingly, that all the historical claims that are laid by Chinese based on the 9-dash line are invalid. Now, this was perhaps very revolutionary arbitration, very one could even say strong or harsh arbitration, because they had clear assumption of how Chinese will respond to it. So arbitration perhaps was based on a premise of not accepting China to come on board, not allowing China to come on board, not creating situation where Chinese could comply with that kind of arbitration. So arbitration itself was aware of this reality, because they knew the response the Chinese have had throughout the year. Such a one-sided arbitration itself was seen by the world that fine, it is a strong arbitration, but it's not pragmatic. It's not going to be really complied by Chinese, and compliance, as UNCLOS says, is final. Provisions of UNCLOS, United Nations Convention, say that arbitration would be final and parties that go to arbitration will have to comply with it. There is no other recourse. But Chinese, because of their reservation that they had submitted in advance, because they never participated in proceedings of arbitration, they flaunted it, saying that they don't accept that arbitration, it means nothing for them. That was on expected lines. But something was to happen which was not on expected lines. Because in May of 2016, Philippines had elections. And Philippines produced a leader, Rodrigo Duterte, which is famous for several things that he has done and several things that he has said. But let us restrict to what he said about arbitration of July of 2016. Now, it's interesting that on 30th June itself, he had been sworn in as president. So it was just very timely. And the judgment comes in within next 10 days. So his first response as president of Philippines was that he's happy to receive that arbitration and he would respect that arbitration. But he would also advise all the stakeholders to really stay calm and sober and not overreact to the arbitration the way it has come about. But we saw very soon that his follow-up speeches and follow-up actions were very different. And he soon started visiting Beijing and started hobnobbing with President Xi Jinping, and ultimately saying that he doesn't really care about claims in South China Sea, at least the western part of Philippines Ocean, as long as he's able to push his development agenda much faster. And you will now be reminded by several other, shall I say, dabang leaders, which are very, it's a normal thing now to have strong, powerful, ambitious leaders, decisive leaders. And most of them have this very interesting development discourse, which is very emphatic. You look around several examples. Now, development discourse, the latest one is Kim Jong-un, for example. He's saying, I have built my nuclear arsenal, I want to use it now to push my development agenda. So he's now seeking concessions. So I'm not naming some examples, but many examples, where development agenda was pushed so hard that he was willing to now lower the Chinese to seek investments into Philippines and not insist on issue of arbitration. And not just that, he has finally agreed to what Chinese have always been saying, of 1 minute, 1 minute, joint development agreement. And I think that's where it is today, it seems. And the final point I want to underline, because I've just maybe 30 seconds or 40 seconds left now, is in this whole process, not only the credibility of arbitration as a process has been undermined, but much more the credibility of both Philippines, and I would extend the argument since we are talking ASEAN, even of ASEAN, credibility has really been hurt because they have not really followed through the legal recourse, which was, and this was the 15th arbitration, it's not the first arbitration under UNCLOS. Several arbitrations that have really resolved several issues before. This was perhaps the most startling arbitration that came about, and thanks to Philippines and ASEAN and the New Deal leader in Philippines more particularly, that I think the arbitration did not come the way it should have come and was not followed up the way it should have followed. And therefore, to me, the credibility of both Philippines as state and ASEAN as an organization stands really under question now. And I think that's a matter of worrying, because that credibility of UNCLOS also comes into question if this is how implementation happens of arbitration or provisions of UNCLOS. Thank you so much. I hope I took few seconds.
Thank you so much, Professor Swaran Singh. In fact, the reason why I was nagging you is because you have to leave latest by 12, so we need to have a few minutes for question and answer session. Before we proceed on that, I would like to welcome our Vice Dean Scope International, Professor Amora. He was the former Vice Foreign Minister of Syria to India, so we are glad to have him here. Now, we would like to have 3 questions. And sorry, the rest you have to hold on because the professor has to leave early. I have Madhavi to ask the first question. Yeah, Madhavi. Do we have a mic? Hold on, the mic is coming. It's coming.
Thank you, sir. My question to you is whether you feel that China's rejection of the jurisdiction of the arbitral tribunal, which is constituted under UNCLOS, whether that shuts the door entirely on the possibility of legal resolution of the dispute, and whether you feel that this rejection has basically undermined the use of international law as a tool to end the dispute.
I can take all
No,
three.
yeah, we'll take. Okay, the second one from Devanshi.
Thank you for your insight, sir. My question to you is, how have Beijing's policies regarding its territorial claims in the East and the South China Sea shaped regional efforts to settle the dispute, since you mentioned the various players?
Okay, we'll take one more. So please identify yourself.
I'm Shubhangi, and my question would be
From which school?
I'm in JJ. Yeah. So my question would be that the Chinese government has been telling their people that the UNCLOS has no maritime, it does not actually have any legitimacy on the delimitation from mandatory dispute settlement. Basically, part of this salami slicing technique and their justification is that in alignment to what they're saying to their people, because that's how they justify their actions.
Thank you. Very pointed questions. And if I knew the caliber, I should have pegged it a little higher. I was elementary in my initial speaking. International law undermined, as you mentioned. I think that's a major concern, as I underlined towards the end. Why so? I think that's important. I'm going to be telegraphic because of shortage of time, and let me make a very controversial statement. Just like religion, law is a fiction that Homo sapiens have created. And to make law, particularly international law, effective, other levers of power, levers of influence must be kept in consideration. So to reinforce UNCLOS as most dependable mechanism of resolving maritime issues, the politics of it should have been taken care of, and I think that was missing by international law is appearing to be weakened after this example. Beijing's policy, how is it influencing the other regional players and regional groupings? I think Beijing's enormous economic rise, and now we are talking of Belt and Road Initiative, which is going to give infrastructure to everybody at home on terms and conditions that people can't refuse. That enormous economic prowess Chinese have utilized, and they have always maintained that they would prefer to talk all these issues in bilateral format rather than multilateral format. So regional organization, the most visible in this case is ASEAN. They have not allowed ASEAN to take on this issue together vis-a-vis Chinese. And on the other side, flip side of the coin, ASEAN also has failed to develop a joint strategy. Only 4 of the 10 have issues with South China Sea, and others don't want to rattle their relationship with China and benefits that they draw from China by standing in line and singing the same tune, which is harsh anti-Chinese. So Chinese have somehow managed successfully to not allow regional body ASEAN to create a combined kind of response on South China Sea. There is code of conduct, etc., but that's also not very effective in this case. I have no time to go into it. Let me quickly reflect to the third question of maritime and land issues, and that's a very interesting point she has raised here. Chinese have said we do not increasingly justify UNCLOS as the format which should be used to deal with these issues of maritime sovereignty of China and others in South China Sea, because they are saying these are landed properties of China. These are not maritime properties. They are saying islands are territories, and UNCLOS has only to deal with oceans, and it doesn't deal with territories. And they have now several of these territories inhabited. What makes, I'm sure you all know, but the definition of island is when you can survive on that island on your own without being dependent on others. That is not fulfilled in many of these islands that China controls today. But they are calling them as island, and they are saying this is not where UNCLOS should be actually applied. And that's a very interesting, innovative way of really saying that this arbitration doesn't belong here. But original argument was that of the reservation, but now this is a new argument they are giving, that this doesn't simply belong here. Thank you so much. I should stop here and keep respecting my time, and it was a delight to be here with all of you, and I look forward to more opportunities to be here with you. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. See, we have only 70 minutes left for him to leave. So before he leaves us, we would like to give some token of appreciation to the speaker. So I invite my colleagues to.
So we're really sorry that you had to leave us so early today, and we really benefited from what you taught us. So we would request Professor Amora to present you with the program appreciation.
Too many gifts. It's like I'm being awarded the doctorate of Jindal's profession.
There's a name. A name is written on the scarf. The name is there.
I almost feel I'm awarded doctorate. I really apologize, but I promise this won't happen next time. Then I have to leave quickly. And thank you, my co-panelists, bear with me. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, we will have to continue with our next speaker, which is Abhijit Singh. Unfortunately, as a chair of the session, I would like to request all the speakers to try to finish within 15 minutes, because we started a little bit late, about 10 minutes or so. But if we have time, we'll spend those time during the question and answer session. So now the floor is for Abhijit Singh. You want to say something? Okay.
No.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
It's all right. Thank you so much, Nitin, for inviting me for this and for that very generous introduction. I've never been to the general school earlier, and actually I've never been to a university like this earlier. So I don't know how much I'm going to enjoy this, but I enjoyed that walk around. That was excellent. As you know, my background, I'm a former naval officer, spent a few years at sea, been studying maritime subjects for a while now. Let me start by saying this. You know, in every area of research and analysis, there is one particular area which is called a black hole subject. Now, what's a black hole subject? If you were, for instance, discussing space, outer space, and astronomy, no matter what you're discussing, planets, intergalactic travel, stars, you finally end up discussing the black hole. The black hole is an existential issue. We all want to know whether we're going to end up in the black hole, what it's going to do to civilization, to Earth, to everything around it. The South China Sea, to put it very simply, is the black hole subject of maritime domain, which is to say that no matter what you're discussing, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, the Atlantic, you always end up with discussing the South China Sea because it lies at the heart of maritime geopolitics. Now, as a segue into my remarks, and they're going to be short remarks, I won't dwell on many of these things for too long. Let me, to make this interesting, refer to a little anecdote. 2 years back, I was at the South China Sea conference that was conducted by Vietnam in Nha Trang. My first time in Vietnam. I had never been part of such a discussion that has both the big powers, the Americans, the Chinese. There was also the French and the Japanese and the others. And I happened to be on a panel in which there was an American and a Chinese and a Vietnamese, and there was two special discussants, one of them from Philippines, the other from Indonesia. The American admiral first spoke, and he said something very interesting. He made a very civil presentation, but it was a sharp presentation. And he pointed out that China actually had got this whole arbitral tribunal thing wrong. He didn't say it in as many words, he was very polite. But what he was wanting to say is that the Chinese, by opting out of the proceedings, had done more harm to themselves than good. Because look, he said, this arbitral tribunal, and for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, in 2013, the Philippines took China to court, the maritime court, to say that their activities within their EEZs were a violation of the law. But as the American admiral explained, the Philippines did not raise any questions about the disputes per se. What the Philippines had asked for was a clarification. And that clarification essentially on 3 counts, something Professor Soran has already spoken about, but let me just say this. The Philippines was interested from getting a clarification from the court whether the 9-dash line that China always keeps talking about is a valid means of staking a historical claim in the South China Sea. Simply a clarification. The second, the Philippines wanted to know from the court whether these features within the Spratlys can be termed as islands. And the reason it wanted to know that if they were islands, then they generated a territorial sea and they generated an EEZ, which is an exclusive economic zone for those of you that don't follow the maritime discourse. And the third thing that the Philippines wanted to know is whether China's activities within that EEZ, their own Philippines EEZ close to Scarborough Shoal, amounted to a violation because it was simply detrimental to the maritime health, to the health of marine life there. And on all 3 counts, the court had ruled in favor of Philippines and against China, but there was no mention at all of a territorial dispute. Now, this was smart strategy on the part of the Philippines because as per the law, you cannot take another party to court if it is a territorial dispute. The court is not authorized to adjudicate on a matter in which you bring up a sovereignty or a territorial dispute, so China should have joined. Now, what was very interesting for me is that when the Chinese academic responded, he responded with a barely concealed contempt. not contempt for the American, but a contempt for Filipinos. And he said that this is a legal ambush. It is perfidy. We have been betrayed by the Philippines because we were supposed to sort this matter out under the DOC. Now, the DOC is an internal, for those of you that follow, is an internal declaration of the conduct of parties. It has no legal teeth. It has no legal bearing. But the Chinese were insisting that we were. Now, no one opposed it. The Philippines were almost embarrassed that they had taken China to court. The Indonesians did not choose to speak on the matter at all. They were speaking about the maritime fulcrum tactics, or the maritime fulcrum strategy that President Joko Widodo has come up with. Nobody addressed the question head on. It was left to the delegate from the UK to finally offer some pushback to the Chinese presentation or Chinese aggression. I came away with three distinct impressions. First, the South China Sea is not just about the disputes that's happening. It's not even about the resources which is there. For China, it is a question of Chinese identity. This goes down to a very deep-seated chauvinism within China. And the Chinese believe that they have, for some reason, been denied their rightful place under the sun. This is a conspiracy against China's rise. And when you're dealing with such a state or with a partner that holds such views, it's very difficult to have an honest-to-goodness conversation. That was my first takeaway. My second takeaway was that this discourse on the South China Sea is essentially being mediated by just two players, China and the US. The rest of us actually are just onlookers. We are on the sides, our opinions don't matter, but the real problem is that we are being forced to take sides. And there is a price to pay, as China has made it known, on those actors that choose not to take sides. And therefore, you're one side or the other. Either you support the US or you support China, but if you stay in the middle, you actually earn the ire of both sides. My third takeaway was that under pressure from China, what these small states are resorting to as a counter strategy is not so much, and I'm assuming here that a lot of you sitting here know international relations, and you always learn about balancing and bandwagoning. The rest of the smaller states within the South China Sea are not doing so much balancing and bandwagoning. What they're doing is strategic hedging. And strategic hedging essentially means that you're acting in contradictory ways, simply to broaden your options, to reduce the risk and to maximize gains. Now, this is a very risky strategy because it creates great uncertainty in the minds of all the other players. Now, 18 months from the time that I attended that conference, have things changed? Yes and no. No, because all of the things that I just mentioned are equally true today as they were then. Yes, because what we are seeing evolve are the bare outlines, the bare contours of two distinct strategies. They're still evolving, but they are tangible. You can see them evolve. On the Chinese side, I would say, and again, for those who studied, this should be interesting, there's a three-pronged strategy, or actually a 3.5-pronged strategy that I see being followed. The Chinese first are resorting to this dual strategy of what they say coercion and inducement. Coercion meaning trying to use force to get the other partners to follow its diktats. And inducements in that they're offering greater development, joint development, oil and gas exploration, investments in maritime infrastructure, as you know, under the One Belt, One Road or the Belt and Road initiatives. So they are some ways creating an economic incentive for small players to come and support the Chinese position. But on the other side, they're using force. And for those of you that have been following the maritime domain, Vietnam very recently was forced to send a Spanish company that was drilling for oil within its easiest home called Repsol, because the Chinese had put so much of pressure on them. The Chinese have also increased their maritime militia presence close to the Scarborough Shoal. They now control all the access points to the Scarborough Shoal. So that's, again, an example of how coercion and inducement is going hand in hand, side by side. The second, I would say, is that the Chinese are experts in creating facts on the ground. They're just changing the geography of the South China Sea. And if you look at their reclamation and militarization that is happening within the Spratly Islands, and particularly 3 of those islands where they have constructed
minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So I have just 5 minutes. So they have constructed these airfields, they have other garrisons, etc. It becomes very clear that the Chinese actually want to control the South China Sea. They have now installed radars, they have installed some communication, jamming equipment, and the US now, the senior US admiral who was being interviewed a few days back, he's the nominee for the Pacific Command, and he said very clearly that if China now controls the South China Sea, barring a war with the US, means if we've got to get back control of the South China Sea, we've got to fight with them. On the American side, I'm just going to quickly wrap up because I've got just 5 minutes. The Americans have come up with a strategy called the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Now, under the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, America wants to work with all its other partners to create a rules-based order. On the face of it, it looks pretty sound because the Americans are also promising to increase their maritime presence, their naval presence within the South China Sea, and are doing so. There was 3 aircraft carriers recently within the South China Sea. The trouble, I think, with the Free and Open Indo-Pacific is that it is completely dependent, or in the main it is dependent on the partnership between 4 major democracies called the Quad, the quadrilateral democracies, Australia, Japan, India, and the US. But this strategy doesn't seem to be going down very well with ASEAN because ASEAN believes it detracts from the centrality of ASEAN in the whole Indo-Pacific. They actually don't like the fact that Asia-Pacific is now Indo-Pacific. Plus, a lot of other countries are seeing this as an Asian NATO, which is again provocative, and it's not going down too well with these states. Now, the ASEAN is a house divided. It does play a part in these big power rivalries, but look at the way in which President Duterte, that again Professor Soran spoke about, has actually been compromised and cultivated by China, to the extent that the Filipino president now is almost a front man for China and Chinese interests. But the Chinese are doing this with country after country, and every country now, just recently at the Boer Forum, the Singaporeans were almost on their knees telling China to let's get into a partnership with each other, because the Trump policies, this Trump America first and all of that, just bilateral trade, protectionism is not going down very well with these countries. Last, I don't have too much time. I'm going to take just final 2 points. Is that from the 2 countries that we are seeing some concrete action happening in the South China Sea that is actually coherent and makes sense to a lot of us, is actually Japan and Australia. Japan's version of the Free and Indo-Pacific, unlike the American model, has an economic component to it. The Japanese are insisting on infrastructure building. They're doing a lot of work with India and other ASEAN partners within there. They're insisting on development and other areas where there can be an economic benefit for all sides. The Australians have a more hawkish line on China. They have increased their presence within the South China Sea, but at the same time, the Australians also want a sort of an alliance with ASEAN in which they can build infrastructure together. And that, for an Indian onlooker, for an Indian observer, is a positive development. Finally, what is India's take on this matter? I believe we are more aware of what is happening in the region. We are more informed of the South China Sea, but really we are proactive fence sitters. We are still on the fence, but we are speaking in a loud voice, more voluble, more visible. But we're really, for all practical purposes, still on the fence. We still talk about freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, other things, peaceful resolution of the disputes. But I don't think we are at any point thinking of getting involved into the disputes. My recommendation, if I have 1 more minute, would be for India to understand that the competing interests between the various players is making this great power rivalry in the South China Sea more fraught. And if India does not take a firm stand on these matters, we will be left by the wayside. During the recent ASEAN-India summit, ASEAN leaders said so much to the Indian side that infrastructure building, integration, connectivity is fine, but we want you to take a harder stand on what's happening in the South China Sea, Chinese aggression in the region. I think we've got to stop being fence sitters and play a role, but we have to understand that whichever way you mediate this whole dispute, ultimately you've got to look for what is in English called a modus vivendi, which is to look for a way of working with all sides. We are open to working with China. The Chinese have got to stop this open aggression, and unless we don't make our presence felt on the world stage, on the ASEAN stage, I don't think we're going to make much progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abhijit. For those of you who have not got a chance to look at the program. The first speaker, Professor Swaransi, was talking on a topic, 2016 arbitration ruling and the ramifications. And Abhijit Singh was talking on a topic, great power rivalry in the South China Sea. So, as I have been saying to my students, whenever we talk about South China Sea disputes, you cannot avoid talking. There is always overlapping issues. So if you listen all the speakers, some of them will touch upon the same issue because that's the nature of the conflict or the nature of the complexity. So having said that, now I would like to invite my friend Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh from IDSA. He is going to talk about ASEAN perspective on the South China Sea disputes. Fifteen minutes.
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Kipgen and OP Jindal University for inviting me here. This is my first visit to this university, and it's been a pleasure to see this university coming out. Can I have a conference? No, how do I?
Oh, just look.
Yeah.
Do we have the pointer? Do we have pointer?
For changing the slide.
Does it work?
So basically, I want to talk about the various perspectives of the ASEAN countries on the South China Sea. The area that we are now talking about is not Asia Pacific. We are talking about the Indo-Pacific, the larger area, which basically includes both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and extending right from Australia and the Pacific Islands down to the East African coast. So there has been a change in the way we are looking at this entire region, and this is the larger Indo-Pacific region, to put it in perspective, and South China Sea is a part of it. Basically, there has been a shift from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, and this shift is very significant from the point of view of strategy, from the way the nations of the world are looking at this region. Primary reason for that is the economic transformation that this region has witnessed. The countries of this region are leaders of economic transformation, and there has been a lot of development taking place, from the tiger economies that was mentioned earlier to China rising and also India rising. All this has led to its impact on the maritime domain. There has been an impact on the maritime domain because when you have economies developing in this region, whether it is ASEAN, whether it is East Asia, the economic development leads to some kind of a pressure on the maritime domain. That means you require locks which are free, and you can travel from one point to another easily, and it promotes transportation, free and easy transportation. And also the energy routes are located in this area, and that also needs to be ensured. This has led to arterial forms of shipping. There are certain choke points which can be a problem for area of concern for the countries of the region. So nations, particularly the more advanced nations like China, are very conscious that these choke points don't become a problem for their maritime domain. And therefore, they are looking at various alternatives in case there is a blockage of trade routes in the sea. And that is why you come across such proposals like the Kra Canal across Thailand, how to avoid the Malacca dilemma in case the Malacca Straits are blocked. That is one of the main concerns of China. And you have China looking at a route through Myanmar to the Indian Ocean so that some of its areas which are landlocked can have access not only to the South China Sea but to the Indian Ocean. So this is the way the Indo-Pacific has been developing in the region and affecting the maritime domain. Now, as far as the South China Sea is concerned, we find that the situation has been both complex and simple. It is complex primarily because of the multiple disputes that are taking place in this region between China on the one hand, Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia as the countries which are involved in the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. The simplicity lies in the fact that only one claimant, which is China, which is doing the primary job of regional primacy. It is China which is going to dominate this region, and it is moving in that direction. Whereas the others are only protecting their claims. Whatever claims they have in the South China Sea, they are trying to maintain the status quo. Whereas China is claiming almost 90%, as the previous speakers have spoken, 90% of the South China Sea. Now, the significance of this region, the South China Sea, is that SLOCs account for half of global ship tonnage in this area. Third of global crude oil passes through it. Half of global LNG trade passes through the South China Sea. In fact, even coal from Australia and Indonesia are routed through this region. Asian countries, because they have become factories for the world, are using the maritime domain for all their transport. In fact, maritime transport has become the cheapest available source for transporting finished products, and also, of course, the natural resources. Oil and gas reserves pass through this area. Oil and gas reserves, in fact, underneath the surface of the South China Sea is what the nations of this world have their eyes on. And of course, as you know, keeping in mind the food security, the fisheries potential of this region makes South China Sea very important. Now, if you look at the South China Sea situation as a whole, unresolved maritime disputes make this region important. Uncertainty about the freedom of navigation, that is a concern of the less powerful nations. And if you look at the history of these disputes, in 1992, ASEAN as an organization tried to solve some of these problems by adopting the declaration on the South China Sea. And the objective of this was to urge self-restraint by all parties. And later on in 2002, ASEAN and China signed a non-binding declaration of conduct, or the DOC as it is called. The importance of DOC is that it is not yet a a lawful kind of a document. It is not a legal document. It is a non-binding declaration of conduct. Then in 2012, ASEAN, which meets quite often, meets regularly, at a meeting, ASEAN summit, normally they have a joint communique at the end of each summit and meeting. But in 2012, differences on the South China Sea were such that they were unable to produce a joint communique that year. 2012 is a landmark year because it shows that ASEAN was failing somewhere. It was failing because of lack of agreement on an important issue like the South China Sea. And the reason was that the meeting which was held in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, Cambodia was being influenced adversely by China. And because of the pressure of China, the agreement at Phnom Penh could not produce a joint communique because China did not want any adverse mention of Chinese role in the South China Sea. Why is ASEAN concerned? There are obvious economic reasons for this. There are economic gains to be had by control of South China Sea. The natural resources I have already mentioned, the fisheries, the energy resources which lie underneath the bed of the sea, military reasons. Because of this South China Sea region being so important, there has been an escalation of the military budget in each of the ASEAN countries. If you look at the last decade or so, you find that the military budgets of all these countries has been rising, and rising quite dramatically. And there has been an investment in military hardware in most of the countries, including Indonesia, including Myanmar, including Singapore. All these countries have seen military purchases in all the three wings. And in the maritime domain, especially the navies have been expanding over the years. Geopolitical reasons, you have all the major powers interested in this region, and their extra-regional presence is creating its own dynamics. And in fact, the presence of the US ship recently in South China Sea was a cause of concern because it created a lot of tension with China. And this is an important factor for causing great concern for ASEAN countries. All these 10 ASEAN countries that you see, starting from Myanmar to the Philippines, are involved in one way or another in the South China Sea. 5 minutes. How has ASEAN responded to this? ASEAN is faced with many challenges. Presently, you are going to have elections in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and also Cambodia. The Rohingya crisis is another important event which is disturbing the region. There are continuing tensions within Philippines domestically, but ASEAN as a whole wants to retain the centrality. Through ASEAN-India Common Summit, India-ASEAN Commemoration Summit, which took place in 2018 in New Delhi, there was an agreement between the ASEAN states and India, and the South China Sea did figure in the Delhi Declaration that was signed. How do I see the way ahead? ASEAN can consider two measures for dispute management. One is, one way which has been suggested is joint development. Joint development basically means under Article 74 and 83 of UNCLOS, it is a provisional measure applied only in maritime zones where overlapping claims occur. and it is not for resolving sovereignty disputes. For instance, between Vietnam and Malaysia in 1992 in the Gulf of Thailand, and between Vietnam and China on joint fishery zone in the Gulf of Tonkin. China, however, has been using joint development to get recognition to its sovereignty claims and rejects arbitration ruling, which Professor Swaran Singh has mentioned and earlier has been mentioned. Code of conduct is another way of solving this problem, and we are moving towards that. Code of conduct negotiations between ASEAN and China are ongoing, and they began in March 2018, and they are not likely to be concluded by the end of this year, unfortunately. The code of conduct could become more like a forum. That is the danger, that the code of conduct, instead of becoming a binding kind of thing, it may just become another place to talk about, a channel of communication than a strong measure in practice. Finally, China's Global Times has reacted sharply to the US aircraft carrier Carl Vinson to Vietnam, its visit last month. Vietnam will pursue international law as a core interest and will welcome phone ops and port calls. Vietnam and Singapore will push for code of conduct and a more meaningful code of conduct under ASEAN framework. Vietnam's Deputy Prime Minister Pham Binh Minh called on ASEAN states to stand up for ASEAN viewpoint on South China Sea and solve disputes through peaceful means. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uday, for finishing within 15 minutes. I want to remind everybody again that we are streaming live this session, and we'll also be uploading the entire session on YouTube in a day or two. And we'll also be writing a report. My research assistants are working on it as the session goes on. And now we have the last speaker, not the least, China's position and strategy in the South China Sea dispute. We have Captain Sarabjit Singh Parmar to speak on the issue. I know China, because of its vast claim area and the 9-line history, has been the most talked about country in the South China Sea dispute. So now the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
We've got a very strict headmaster, so I'll keep it short at 15. He said no lunch, so I'll just keep it short. Thank the university and the center for this opportunity. My first visit here, I'm overawed. I'm a little hesitant in speaking. I just landed up from Mumbai a week back, so I'm still getting used to the change in temperature, and I'm back to academics after a hiatus of 4 years in uniform. I was in IDSA earlier. Okay, set the ball rolling. If I get this one correct. Right. Now this is the South China Sea. Abhijit mentioned black holes. These are the smaller black holes that start with it. And if I've got the pointer right, here we are. Right from the southeast to Natuna, I'll take it to the Louisiana Reefs, Spratly Islands, Scarborough Reef, Macclesfield, Paracels, and up to Pratas, there in the northwest. This is the area of South China Sea dispute. 6 nations are there in it. And Spratlys, and incidentally, none of these islands have any indigenous population. That is a fact. And I'll come to Article 121, which is referred to about the regime of rocks a little later. Quick run through, what is the dispute about? It's about sovereignty and territorial issues, resulting in overlapping maritime claims, which have affected the aspects of freedom of navigation and overflight. Dr. Swaran Singh mentioned features. This is what is occupied. We got China in 8, Vietnam in 29, Taiwan in 2, and incidentally, Taiwan occupies the biggest Ituaba and has claims to be the oldest occupant of any island dating back to the 70-71. Philippines 8, Malaysia 8, Brunei nil. Small country, doesn't have too much of maritime capability. This does not include any reclaimed islands which have been dug up from the past and developed upon. So we are looking here as these as original rocks, natural land features which the Article 121 clearly states. What are the Chinese interests in this? Strategic. You get a buffer to the mainland. What is the biggest fear? That they will not be able to thwart an invasion if it takes place, or if the US comes too close to their allies. So they want a buffer to the mainland, so they're pushing outwards. Encirclement and isolation of Taiwan, that has been the main reason for China's interest close to their border. Plus the South China Sea gives an excellent training ground for their developing maritime capabilities and military capabilities, and also offers a springboard for power projection beyond the first island chain. These are the basic Chinese strategic interests. Energy and trade as resources has already been covered. Just to give you the gas figures, what Dr. Swaran Singh mentioned, this almost equals the reserves of Qatar, which has got the largest gas reserve if they are approved. And sea lines of communication are there. Essentially, India's sea lines of communication also transit to there, our trade comes to there. So therefore, if you have a certain control on this area, you have a modicum of control over energy security and flow of trade of other nations. So what makes China so assertive? We can debate whether it is the declining US power or the relative increase in Chinese power vis-a-vis the US. The sense of rising nationalism, not only in China, but in most of the Southeast Asian nations as far as sovereignty and territorial issues are concerned. The most important aspect is the leadership. You are looking at continuity. Now, if there is going to be a continuity in the leadership, obviously the policies and the aspirations of the Chinese leadership is going to be pushed. And that is what I think is going to happen. So we're going to have a fun time in the South China Sea. Let's see how it works out. A weak ASEAN. My colleague Uday has already covered it. A lot of arm twisting. There's a lack of consensus on the code of conduct. And just to bring you a little back into history, when ASEAN first requested the Philippines and Vietnam to draft the first DOC, China, of course, threw it out of the window. Malaysia also objected, saying that it is too legally binding. Now, that is the blockage. So it is not only China. All of these nations have a vested interest in doing it. And of course, there are internal differences in ASEAN itself. 6 of the nations are not party to the dispute, so they have very little to say. Have been covered up there. A lot of arm twisting. The 2012 communique, in fact, if there was something that was missed out, that there was no mention made of the South China Sea dispute, apparently a lot of arm twisting took place in the back corridors of the ASEAN meeting there, and of course, China reigned supreme. What is the result? You are having a power transition and a shift in the balance of power. And that is what is happening. And that is where the ball is going to stop, and that is where the new ball will start rolling, depending upon who turns up winners in the power transition. This is a diagram dated 1958 by Organsky, where he made this inverted pyramid on the power transition. The bottom colonies row we can disregard now. This is long past. So you have the satisfied nations above the line and the dissatisfied nations beyond the line. It's a dynamic line. It depends upon the region. What I'm going to concentrate out is middle power. Now, what is a middle power? Unlike a great power, it has lesser influence on other states, but yet has sufficient ability to shape international events. So what is China's status and position? China's economic rise, military modernization, and assertiveness aids its power transition. So where do we position China in that pyramid? Let's say we put it in the Western Pacific region, which also encompasses the South China Sea, as a great middle power with greater power leanings and a dominant nation aspiration. That is where it is heading. And I'll put a final ending to this when I look at the last slide at the prognosis. I just want you to keep this in mind. So this is what is leading it on. The Middle Kingdom wants to grow and expand. What has been the shift in stances so far? In 1998, when you look at the military white papers, there was a focus on modernization, economic security, and the national policy was defensive, what they termed active defense. Let's fast forward to 2015, the first white paper on military strategy. From active defense, they've come to offshore waters defense with open seas protection. There is a calling for security overseas interests. There is a calling for preparation for military struggle. There is a continued military modernization. There is stress on informatization and the development of a cyber force. The ambit has increased, and it will only keep on increasing. I'll take you to China's A2AD, which is in consonance with the 2015 one. Now, A2AD is more of a Western terminology. That is anti-access area denial. Anti-access simply means that you deny any entity entry into area of interest. Area denial means if you cannot do that, then once your adversary in the area, you prevent that person from maneuvering into a position of advantage. The Chinese have a different term for the A2AD. They call it the active strategic counterattacks on exterior lines. Now, this is the Chinese strategic concept. It is similar to the A2AD concept that the West calls it. The catalyst was the Taiwan crisis of 95-96. If you would remember, 95-96 series of missile firings across the Taiwan Straits. The US president sailed into carrier strike routes. Now, there is a confusion here. Apparently, the CSGs did not sail through the Taiwan Straits, as so claimed by the US, because they were also scared that they would get attacked by the Chinese. The Chinese were a little apprehensive. They did not know how they would be able to counter the carriers once they entered into that area. So there was a sort of a standoff, a Mexican standoff between the US, the China, and the rest of the world, and both stuck to their guns. But the catalyst was the Taiwan crisis of 95-96, which led to the development of subsequent military things like ASBMs, nuclear submarines, and emphasis now on the carrier. So what are these main aspects of the ASCEL? First of all, it is at a strategic and it is not at an operational level. It will be conducted throughout a conflict should it take place, as far away from the Chinese mainland as possible. And it is essentially asymmetric, means against a superior adversary. So essentially it is pointed at the US and its allies, specifically the US. It is a counteract, therefore it is reactive, which means that China would not fire the first shot. It would wait. So therefore, looking at international law, it would be acting in self-defense. The main area for this would be between the first and the second island chains. If you remember, I had said strategic buffer from the mainland. Let's take a look. Your first island chain, you look at the southeastern part, it actually is akin to the 9-line. You look at the second island chain, it moves away. Now, over a period of time, with the number of exercises that China has conducted, they have managed to pierce the first island chain. And in the last couple of years, they have successfully entered the second island chain, which means they are pushing outwards, as I said, to keep the adversary far away. It suits them very fine because in the South China Sea, there will be minimum interference from outside nations, or what they call as out of area nations. What you see on the right bottom is the coverage of China's Beidou navigation system. Right from the Strait of Hormuz, it goes right into the center of the Pacific Ocean. And I wouldn't hazard to guess that the military satellites would have a similar coverage, which means anything that happens in the Indo-Pacific is covered. So they have a good picture of what's happening. So this area, as I said, if you move outwards to the second island chain, is ideal for thwarting any interference in the South China Sea area. Main components are the anti-ship ballistic missile. Main targets are the US carriers. Land attack missiles, again the main targets are the airfields of the US and its allies. And at sea would be ships, aircraft, submarines, assisted by space-based assets, as I just explained on that small picture there. And land and sea-based sensors, which they are developing over the various islands they are covering. Now, after the arbitration tribunal, China apparently has changed tack and has come to a 4-Sha claim. Now, Sha in Mandarin means sand. And before we go ahead, I'll just put one thing, that UNCLOS was established with due regard for the sovereignty of all states. The question on sovereignty territory issue that came out here, so this will maybe clarify that. This sentence is from the 4th para of the preamble of UNCLOS. More interestingly, it is a generally accepted principle of international law that sovereignty over land is the basis for determining maritime rights. You look at various ICJ judgments, they all point to it, including spanning from South America to Europe. So after the arbitration case, the Chinese apparently had a closed door meeting with the Americans, and they have a four-sharp claim where they are seeking sovereignty over 4 island groups: Pratas, Paracel, Spratly and Macclesfield. And this is based on their law on the territorial sea and contiguous zone dated 1992. And they could claim straight baselines for generating territorial seas. I'll throw in a new terminology here, lawfare. What is lawfare? It's a mixture of law and warfare. Essentially, it's a US creation 2009 strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for the traditional military means to achieve an operational objective. Interestingly, it was mentioned in a book written by 2 colonels of the PLA in 1999. You can also extend it to achieve your strategic objectives. How do the Chinese do it? Look at certain UNCLOS declarations the Chinese made on ratification of UNCLOS, reaffirming its sovereignty over all its archipelagos, islands, etc., based on the 92 law. This was upon ratification of UNCLOS. Secondly, the provisions of the UNCLOS concerning innocent passage through the territorial sea shall not prejudice the right of a coastal state to request in advance notification. Nothing surprised about it. We have the same sort of language in our MZI Act of 1976, in which we seek prior approval. We're on the same page as the Chinese are concerned on a lot of these issues. Chinese regulations for maritime spatry fisheries product. They defined the waters in the 9-dash line south of 10 degrees latitude as Spratly Islands, and therefore issued licenses for fishing anywhere in these waters, which led to standoffs with the various nations, especially Philippines. The 2012 Hainan Maritime Regulations applicable to ships entering waters illegally, specifically territorial waters, which essentially meant that if you did not take permission, you are illegal. And it catered for action to be taken on 6 occasions. You can look through this act, it's all regulations, it's given in that. They also proposed changes to the 84 Maritime Safety Law. From 53 articles, they wanted it increased to 134, delineating of various zones, including forbidden zones and areas of military use, which means that you're restricting the sea area, which comes to the area denial part, and reiterates requirement for permission for foreign military vessels prior entering China's territorial seas. What we also see is the frequently challenging of warships and military aircraft. Last Friday, they challenged 3 Australian naval ships en route to Vietnam. So that is a continuous affair. A little on the force levels. This is what I've got from the military balance of 2018. This is what they can put into force in the South China Sea and beyond. They have built 83 ships in 8 years. There has been a reduction in numbers, but an increase in tonnage, which essentially means they are taking out old ships, but bringing in long endurance ships, which means their staying power at sea is much more. These are supported by tankers and possible refueling facilities at reclaimed islands. Therefore, they can deploy sufficient assets in the South China Sea and up to the second island chain with adequate support. They are in the Indian Ocean region already with their anti-piracy support forces, so they're expanding. Additionally, the placement of the Coast Guard recently under military controls gives more flexibility for planned operations in distant areas, which means you hand over the constabulary duties to the Coast Guard under military control and let your naval ships move out. I love this map for the simple reason is that let's assume for once that the Paracel Islands dispute is over with. If you were to give these 4 islands of Spratly, Thitu, Ituaban, Scarborough Reef, their full maritime zones, you will have no high seas in the South China Sea. But since the arbitration tribunal has said that these are all rocks and therefore cannot generate an EZ, limiting it to territorial seas and contiguous zones, those circles get reduced along those pock marks. Therefore, when you enter the South China Sea, it's going to be like walking over sharp pebbles barefoot, and navigation will become a problem. And that is where the challenging part and the maritime jurisdictional issues of China come up. What is the prognosis? China's national strategic goal is realization of the Chinese dream for achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, straight from the 2015 military strategy paper. Start point is emergence of China as a dominant nation in the region in lieu of the US. So go back to the power transition issue. Continue the military modernization. Continue PLA reforms, which is more emphasis on joint operations. Theatre commands have come in. Let's see how they progress. Enhance the global maritime footprint, while not forgetting to maintain an aggressive maritime posture based on its claims of sovereignty, interpretation of the international law. I finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Parma. You finished in 16 minutes, just 1 hour, 1 minute above the limited, the time given to you.
We got carried away,
Yeah.
so one drink.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Chair got carried away.
Yeah, okay. All right, before we go on to a Q&A session, I would like to acknowledge the presence of my colleague, Sasha, from School of International Affairs, and also Dr. Musuni Mukherjee is here. She is Executive Director of Center for Comparative and Global Education. Thanks for coming. And also my students, all former students and current students. Thanks for your presence again. Now what we are going to do is we are about 15 minutes behind the schedule. Is it over? Okay, is it 15 minutes? Around 10? Around 10, 15 minutes. But anyway, we can spend another 30 minutes for Q&A session. So what I'm going to do is first invite 4 questions. Then we will have about 3 rounds of Q&A session. And I already have about 8 students who have submitted their questions in advance. I'm going to call them out their names, and you please stand up, identify yourself, so that the speakers can know who you are, what's your name, which school you belong to, and what batch. And then in the 3rd round, I will take questions from the audience. The 1st and 2nd round will be people who have submitted their questions in advance. Okay, first I would like to invite Somya, who is a research assistant in Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Please identify yourself and also tell your question, which address to which speaker. Okay.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for those wonderful insights. My question is directed towards Mr. Uday Bhagat. So you spoke on the ASEAN perspective, and I just wanted to inquire if the unity in the ASEAN organization as such will play any significant role, especially when Philippines seems to be a victim of Chinese aggression, and the Philippines will also be heading the ASEAN-China dialogue from August 2018. So will the unity in ASEAN organization have any role to play in the conflict resolution?
Okay, the second person is Sagun. You have a question?
My question is towards Mr. Abhijit. If China's coercion and inducement strategy, specifically through economic incentive, the main hindrance to achieving Asian unity in the South China Sea, is this responsible for the commitment or the lack of countries like Cambodia and Laos in Asian seas?
Okay, the 3rd one, Sahima.
So my question is to Abhijit sir. So in your talk you mentioned about Australia. So if you could just elaborate a bit more on the Australian policy on the South China Sea dispute and whether it has been consistent over years or if it has changed and how.
And the 4th one from Versa. The question.
Good morning, professors, and thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I have a few questions, and one of them being considering.
Can you limit to just one question? Just choose one of them.
So can I ask the rest of the questions in the third round?
If we have time, but for now only one question.
Okay, so my question is to you, sir, Dr. Uday. On what parameters can ASEAN as an institution grow? It is in addition to what Soumya already asked, that considering whatever she asked, and my question inherently is on what parameters does ASEAN has the potential to grow as a regional institution to contain or at least try to contain China? Thank you.
Okay, the speakers. Who wants to go first?
I'm lucky.
Uday?
I think the question which most of you are seeking an answer to is about ASEAN's centrality and whether the organization which was formed way back on 8th of August 1967, whether after 50 years of its formation, it is losing steam. and whether ASEAN can play uh, an important role in the South China Sea dispute. The main thing about ASEAN that we need to remember is that all decisions are taken by consensus. An important aspect of ASEAN is their whole concept of consultation among themselves. It's called Mashwara and Mufakkar. And that is what these countries, the 10 countries of ASEAN, are known for. So, in a kind of a tribal kind of a setting, you know that all decisions are arrived at unanimously. The same kind of thing has been carried forward by ASEAN. And when it was founded, it was a smaller structure, but from 5, from 3, it has grown to 10, and it has included countries which are not economically so advanced. The Indo-China countries, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam were amongst those who joined much later. Now, the problem about the Indo-China countries, especially a country like Cambodia and Laos, Vietnam is case sui generis. It is a very nationalist country, but the other countries of Indo-China are susceptible to influence by China, which is the dominant power in the region, and with which they share the common border. So, because of that, and because of the economic clout, the military clout of China, they have not been able to exert their influence. So, this is the weak spot of ASEAN, and China has exploited this weakness of ASEAN. And as I mentioned in my talk also, 2012 they were able to prevent ASEAN from issuing a joint communique. Now, things like conflict resolution is a problem with ASEAN. We must remember that ASEAN should not be compared with a Western organization like the European Union, which is developed in a, which has a different, has had a different trajectory. ASEAN is developing in its own way. Its own consultation has its own plus points, its own advantages, and I think I'll leave it at that. On what parameters can ASEAN grow? That was the other question. I think one thing that all the ASEAN countries are agreed about is that they do not intend to contain China. I think that is not something which is, they plan to coexist with China, and that is what makes their relationship with China somewhat complicated. And China, because of its influence over the smaller ASEAN countries, which I mentioned, Cambodia specifically, has been able to influence ASEAN's growth. Now, if ASEAN wants to grow further and it wants to grow from what it has been, then it has to utilize its interlinkages with the other major powers. One great feature of ASEAN's interactions is that it has been able to engage all the major powers of the world. whether it is Canada, USA, Russia, Japan, or India for that matter, it has been able to engage them. And that is again a plus point of ASEAN, and some would say that that is also been a weakness of SAARC in the South Asian region. So there is a lot which other organizations can learn from ASEAN, and what appears to be weaknesses of ASEAN at the current stage, I would say is not really a weakness. It is an organization which is an evolution, and we will see that ASEAN will be able to overcome some of the problems which it has seen in the past, and it's evolutionary and it will grow.
Right. So there were two very interesting questions for me. The first question is on ASEAN unity and how it has been compromised, as you were asking me, by this dual strategy of coercion and inducement. Let me say this very critically. The divisions in ASEAN are actually old. Laos and Cambodia have, for many years now, actually supported the Chinese position. And that's because they're smaller countries, weaker countries, in the sense that China can actually support them in many ways by economic, inducements, etc. But I think what's very interesting that's happened in recent years is that whilst in the past that balance of opinion within the ASEAN was against China, because the big powers, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, had all taken a hard stance against China because they wanted to protect their own interests. That balance is now shifting, in that the Philippines, to an extent even Vietnam, and Indonesia now, that wants so much of help from China for Joko Widodo's infrastructure projects, are all beginning to think that it's better to be on the Chinese side than it is to be on the American side. This is fueled also by the fact that there is a perception that the US is perhaps in decline, particularly under President Donald Trump, who seems to have no idea about what economic policies should be applied to this region. The other factor that I think is very important and that we must take into cognizance or consideration is that the discourse within China of what it means to be a dominant maritime power in the region. A couple of years ago, actually, in the 18th Party Congress in 2012, there was a discussion in China that was monitored by all of these small countries on what it takes to be a maritime power. And the Chinese were like, it's not about just physically dominating that space, it is having the ability to manage the strategic dynamic in that space. So you should be able to nurture that space, you should be able to exploit that space, you should be able to, in some ways, protect that space and control the dynamic in that space. Now the Chinese are going all out. They've taken what I would typically call a no prisoners taken approach. That we are simply going to go out there and underline our prominence and our preeminence in the region. It is working for China, and it's working because a lot of these countries now are beginning to shift together. Now this is classical hedging, you could call it. They perceive that at this moment it's perhaps better not to sort of oppose China and not be seen on the US side, but it could very soon change if you have a new US president and if you have the other, if you have some other dynamics that come together in a way that support the ASEAN, maybe this will change. The second question to me was on Australia's policy. In 2013, let me just say, up until 2013, Australia was really a typical US ally. It simply followed US foreign policy in the region. Since 2013, when they came up with their first white paper, and after that, now recently they've come up with a foreign policy white paper and a defense white paper. They have a clear sense of their place in the Indo-Pacific region. Now the Australians are the biggest proponents of the whole term Indo-Pacific, and the way the Australians see this, and this is primarily a kind of a balancing strategy, in which you can somehow, if not contain the rise of China, at least draw the red lines for China to let it know that there is a cost for what it is doing. But the Australians now realize that this is a moment wherein the US might have to start preparing for a post-US order, which is that if Donald Trump's policies don't quite succeed, he has given no indication that his policies are going to be successful. If it all does not come together well, will they be able to make something that's the word that was said sometime like middle part coalitions? Now, middle part coalitions means will they be able to work with India, Japan, and the others? And therefore, the Australians are now taking a harder stand on South China Sea issues. Plus, understand, the Australian establishment has been completely infiltrated by China. There is a great deal of angst within Australia in the way that media, their educational institutes, some of their politicians. I'm sure you've all heard of Sam Dastyari and the controversy surrounding him. What happened with Sam Dastyari? He was since bought over by the Chinese, and so within Australia there is this feeling that if they now don't assert themselves against China, the Chinese will in a sense completely compromise their politics, and therefore there is a movement that you see happen. So for us, I think it's a good thing that the Australians and the Japanese are taking a lot of interest in the Indo-Pacific and in this whole discussion on the South China Sea, because this means that even if the US does not stand on its stand to provide support to this to the Indo-Pacific strategy, we have other partners to work with. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Now, before we go on to the second round of Q&A session, I just want to tell our students that Abhijit is from ORF, Observer Research Foundation, Parmar is from National Maritime Foundation, and Uday is from IDSA, in case you want to pursue some kind of internship program or future job prospects. So it's a good time to catch up with them, talk to them, and get their contact information. So I just want to remind our students who are present today. And for the second round, let me first call on Mr. Gonpo. He is a student in my South China Sea disputes class. And the second, Tahira. And the third, Kunga. The fourth, Anuradha. So please take, tell your question is directed to which speaker?
Good afternoon. Actually, my question is pre-made question, so it was very much answered by Sir Arbitration Singh right now. And my question is related to the statement made by the last speaker, Captain
Parmar.
Captain Parmar, sir. So regarding the counterpart for the counterpart in South China Sea dispute, would the U.S. military navy present in the South China Sea dispute ever be justified? And what would be the ramifications of the United Nations if the armed conflict broke out between the claimant states? These two are my questions.
Could you please repeat?
What would be the military presence?
What would be the military presence?
Yeah. What would be the would the military presence of United States in the South China Sea ever be justified? This is the first question. And the second is, what would be the ramifications? What would be the reaction from the United States if the armed conflict broke out between the claimant state in the South China Sea dispute? Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just want to remind the students as well as the speakers to be precise as much as possible. Okay. The second, Tahira, Kunga, and Anuradha.
Good afternoon. My question is for Vijay sir. So I'm interested in the environmental aspect of the South China Sea. So my question is, when a country creates a management policy regarding the environment, the policy doesn't work because if the other countries follow this policy, it would be seen as accepting the authority of the other country. So for example, when China levies its annual ban on fishing, the other countries tend to violate it. So in an issue like this, what steps can be taken to manage the environment such a transnational subject?
Good afternoon. So my question is directly related with Abhijit sir on territorial disputes. So all the sufferers of the conflict is coming from Taiwan in the Great Power Rivalry. Taiwan independence is so much tied in the South Sea China that is 90% of the Chinese claim will be null and void if Taiwan get independence, because they claim to be the owner of everything. But due to the one China policy, this has not been discussed openly. So if Taiwan becomes independent, China will not have the historical rights that they are claiming now as a basis. So, and even if Taiwan get independence, America will dominate the region with military force much more than now. Yet in the international politics, Taiwan doesn't want to be a province of China. So my question is, why Taiwan doesn't want to have an independence in the context of South China Sea disputes?
My question is directed to Mr. Billy. As he mentioned that coercion and inducement strategy, because I have been writing a paper on the strategies used by China. So it's directed towards the delaying strategy which is used by China, in which it has successfully over the past years maintained its position in the claimed area by buying time in order to claim effective control as a title if it is dragged to the courts. So if now it is dragged to the court, will this claim of effective control by China be held valid, even though that we know that they are maintaining this static position in the disputed region unlawfully?
Repeat that. Drag to the court means what?
Dragged to the court.
Drag to the court.
Yes, sir. If it's dragged to the court, for the if it's dragged to the court and China claims on the basis of effective control through the usage of the delaying strategy, which it has been practicing over a period of time now.
Yeah.
So will this be held valid? Because even though they are having an effective control for this period of duration, long duration, but it's through unlawful means that they are maintaining the position in the disputed region.
Okay, Abhijit, you go first because you have more questions.
So there's a couple of questions for me. Right, so let me just try and answer the questions that were asked. The first one was, is military presence in, that's your question. The question for me was the environmental aspects of look, historically, your question was environmental. Historically, there is only consensus that can drive nations to work together on the environment. The Arbitral Tribunal was very clear about the fact that what China was doing in the Scarborough Shoal, which lie within the Philippines EEZ, amounted to a violation of Philippines' rights, as also the fact that this was in some ways harming the ecology of that region. And therefore, the Chinese were asked to desist from carrying out those activities. Now, the Chinese did comply initially with at least that part of the verdict, that they were physically present in those waters, but they were not doing the kinds of exploration in that water that would again amount to a violation, or that would in some ways repudiate the findings of the court. The UNCLOS, we have to understand, is actually not very strong on environmental issues, because the UNCLOS was essentially drafted to sort out these overlapping claims of nations, and it takes a concrete stand on what are your territorial waters, what's the EEZ. Even on the matter of the EEZs, there was no consensus among the drafters of the UNCLOS, and therefore the EEZs also, the rule of the EEZ actually preserves some of the high seas freedoms for the user states in those waters, which creates the confusion. Because if the user states can use those waters, in some ways they're also polluting those waters. Even though pollution comes directly under the ambit of the responsibilities of the coastal state. So environment is a vague area, and the Chinese have, for instance, with the Vietnamese and with some others, actually have some agreements in which they decide to do certain things or not do certain things. But I believe that the UNCLOS will not really be able to provide much guidance when it comes to issues of environment. And the Chinese might be the biggest culprits in the way that they are harvesting the sea clams, etc. I'm sure you've all heard of that. But the other nations are equally culpable or guilty of this. And I think unless there is a discussion on now, this is a low-hanging fruit, by the way. Nobody has a problem with actually talking about environmental issues. Yes, it hurts some interest because you'll not be able to economically exploit that region as well. But it's not as contentious as the territorial issue, so it can be done. You don't have to force the UNCLOS or the Arbitral Tribunal or any other court to pass an adjudication or a judgment to further the stand taken by some of these states in the region. Second question was on Taiwan's independence. Taiwan is independent in the sense that it makes its own policies, but it is part of China. India recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. I don't think the Chinese are going to cede control over Taiwan anytime soon. I also think that the presence of the US in those waters is going to continue. The US, you have to understand, has been the principal security provider in those waters for all these years. And just because the Chinese are indulging in a show of force does not mean that the US is going to go home anytime soon. So I think that this delaying strategy that was being mentioned in the way the Chinese are using it. What's interesting is that there is a rebalance happening within the Chinese system. In that the Chinese were earlier using a lot of maritime militia to do these activities, but the Chinese Coast Guard is now under the military. The Chinese Coast Guard has now come under the People's Armed Police. And there is a sense that you get that the Chinese are going to be militarily dominant in this region. So the delaying tactics, they don't have to sort of resort to any delaying tactics because they're making a very clear case that we have stakes in the region. We don't need to do salami slicing. We will send in our military forces to do what's needed. Does that answer all questions over there? Is the question on decline of the US? Did someone ask you that?
Presence of US
The presence of the US in the neighborhood, but that I've answered. That the US is not going to go away simply because China has a problem with the US being there. The US has been a dominant power, and the US will continue to be there. I think we've got to give this a little more time because this is an evolving scenario. At this moment, the Chinese are on the ascendant. But that's also because Donald Trump's policies aren't working so well in the South China Sea. But if we, and in the Asia Pacific, but if we give this more time, I think there's going to be a rebalance that will happen. And there is going to be a resetting in ties between India and the other players. And let's see how things happen from there.
To add on to the US presence, you must understand that the US has certain obligations to its allies. Right, which includes coming to their protection and defense should there be a shooting war. Right? And that's the reason why it justifies its presence in the South China Sea. That's one point. Second point is, although the US is not a signatory to UNCLOS, it has said that it will follow it in letter and spirit, which goes against the grain of signing a convention, but yet it supports US interests in the area. That's one issue. As far as there are certain conflicting issues. Please remember that UNCLOS, when it was signed, the ratifying nations were expected to have national laws that would support the UNCLOS aspects which were covered. As far as we are concerned, we had an NZ Act of 1976, which predates UNCLOS, but is in the tenor of UNCLOS. For the simple reason, it was drafted by people who attended all the meetings of UNCLOS at that point in time. Certain nations have not done it. Nations who haven't done it actually again interpret the law as they want to do it. We also do the same, even though we have NZI. And that is where the issue comes in, that even though there is freedom in the EZ, the issue of military activities has not been addressed. It was discussed during the various proceedings and the meetings of UNCLOS, but due to the differences of opinion between those who wanted it, had it, some restrictions on military activities, which actually meant nations who got independence after World War II were one group, and the Western nations were another group. Then, of course, there was a lot of backroom brawling and arm twisting that took place, and therefore there is this grey area of what amount of military activities are acceptable. That is why when you read the declarations, including the Indian declaration, we also say that military activities are not permitted in the EZ. So therefore, when the US justifies its presence in the South China Sea, it interprets the law that's saying whatever is applicable in the high sea is applicable in the EZ of nations. So the justification of US staying is on three accounts. One is its interpretation of UNCLOS. Second, its advocacy of freedom of navigation and overflight. And thirdly, is it has to be there to support its allies, and it goes as per its binding agreements with its allies, specifically South Korea, Japan, and Philippines. With Vietnam, let's see how it works out. They're getting cozy again. Second question was reaction of the UN if there was a war with claimants. Please remember, you are talking about, if you're looking at two main nations, that's China and the US, both are members of the Security Council. Take a leaf from the Korean War, see what happened that time. I think, God forbid, if there is a war by claimants, it's going to be China that is not going to fire the first shot. It may instigate somebody to fire the first shot. I go back to what I said. It will react in self-defense or claim to act in self-defense. And it's only going to happen in case the US steps in. I don't see any other nation going to war over a rock, especially with China. They know that they don't have the capability to do it. Neither with China, by the way. China will not want to do it because it has an international image to stand up. The UN reaction, if you ask me, is going to be highly muted. Because you're going to have Russia standing by the side of China. You must remember they have done a number of exercises there. And most of them have been amphibious. And the first time the Chinese actually did an amphibious exercise was with the Russians. So you have this area growing about, and it's a highly nuclearized area. You've got 3 declared, 1 undeclared nuclear power sitting in this region. It's a parquet. So as far as possible, I don't see any conflict coming up.
Devanshi?
So unfortunately, Professor Mora has a private engagement, so we would like for him to present all our panelists with a memento for a token of appreciation. And after this, we'll have a third round of questions to panelists.
Who's that? The first?
Captain Saraj.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, I have. That's all right. So, thank you for that.
One second. A photo on this place.
Yes.
Take that.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Pleasure, sir. Okay, okay.
I will ask one question and read the answer.
Okay.
I have one question, just very much interested in this. Just a few weeks ago, 1 week ago, yes, 1 week ago, the University of Lebanon in Beirut has sent me an email asking that they have started right now a program for MA and PhD on Asian studies, and they are organizing a seminar on the role of India in this and the Arab world. This I will coordinate with my colleague on how we can have 1, 2, 3, 4, people who can go participate. This is one. My question is, yes, the United Nations and so on, and the role of the United Nations in this 21st century, which is unipolar world, which is the Americans are dominating everybody. And even they say openly, we don't care whether the United Nations, the Security Council resolutions, the veto members' opinion on central strategic issues, we will do what we want. We will lead the world. How do we see the future of these such regional, very sensitive in South China Sea issue after the Middle East? I believe the answer, and my colleague will tell me, and thank you very much. Okay.
If I remember, I'll tell you.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Mora, for joining us for this session. And now we would like to continue with the third round of Q&A session. And I heard somebody, Dhanan Joy. Is that okay? First, let's invite Dhanan Joy. Please tell whose speaker you are directing your question to. And next is Varsha has another one, and Shibhan. Okay.
So my question is towards Captain Kumar. So my question is,
Can you stay closer so that everybody hears?
So my question is, can Quad be seen as a leading power to counter Chinese aggression in the region? And if so, does it undermine the influence of ASEAN in any way?
Varsha?
Sir, knowing that China does not want to internationalize the issue, it wants to solve the issue bilaterally. So can we assume that China is insecure about the historical claims or whatever claims it bases upon for claiming South China Sea?
That's true.
Shibhan?
The question is to whom?
That's to the panel. To the panel.
Okay. Maybe it's more relevant to you.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
So my question is to Professor Abhijit. So you talked about how that India needs to take a stance. Do you think after the recent developments of Doklam, India is finally going to take a stance? Because whatever has been happening, like everyone has been, like Delhi stood its stand and it did not back off, even after many provocations and talks between Beijing. So do you think that now Japan and Vietnam are also going to take very seriously and we're going to take a stand? Also, I have one more question towards Captain Abhijit. So do you think that the energy requirements of China and US, like what do you think, how much do that motivate their involvement and in the South China Sea dispute? And is there some strategic concerns too? Like what would be the composition of their interest in the dispute?
Okay.
Like that would be
All right. We'll try to take one or two more questions. Anybody? Okay, Versa, you have a second question? Okay, yes, you can.
Sir, just like other claimant countries, Indonesia does not claim to be a claimant in the region, whereas it has conflicting complaints regarding the Natuna Islands and the area surrounding it. So, on what basis does Indonesia claims to be a mediator and not a claimant in the region?
Who wants to go first? Okay.
Okay. What a number one. Thank you. Okay. What? Shinzo Abe, sometime back, called something called the diamond. Save 4 nations. Had a natural death. Okay. Now we're looking at the Quad. In fact, during the Raisina dialogue, we had service chiefs from India, the naval chief, Indian naval chief, the Australian, the Pacific commander, right? And so you had these 3 gentlemen there, and you had the Japanese also. So actually, you had all 4 in the naval chiefs. Okay. The Quad is yet to develop. Now the question is, first of all, I don't think it's going to be undermine ASEAN at all. That's one issue. ASEAN is specific to the nations in that area. What you're looking at, the nations who are surrounding ASEAN with a specific agenda in mind. Whether it will be successful, it will depend upon how the governments of these 4 Quad nations take it up. I have not seen much headway with the Indian government taking it up. Australia is too wrapped up with China on economic and industrial issues. If you see the way Australia's white papers go, from being anti-China, it came to pro-China, to neutral in between. So that's the way it is. So if it has to be pushed, it has to be pushed by the US and Japan. I don't see the US also taking too much interest in it right now, obviously because the leadership has changed. And now we've got Xi Jinping maybe for life as possible. It depends upon how his life expectancy goes. But The Quad is yet to develop. It's too premature to say anything. It's still crawling. It's not even started walking. Give it some time. We can then maybe have a look at it. Historical claims you had asked. First of all, the tribunal rejected China's 9-plan on historical claims. There is a methodology in which historical claims go on. A lot of claims of other nations, and the tribunal was very clear that you cannot have a historic claim if you come and go. You've got to be there permanently. And as I mentioned, none of these rocks have any indigenous people. So any historic claim based on presence or because you keep coming and going is not going to be acceptable. And China goes for a bilateral issue because it speaks from a power strength. The moment it goes into multilateral, the whole effort gets diluted. Coming to the same Indonesian and Natuna claims, Indonesia was okay till the time China became a little belligerent in the Natuna oil field. If you remember, there was an incident where they actually had a face-off with the Chinese messenger. So Indonesia may claim to be neutral, but it also realizes that if it stays quiet for too long, the Chinese will become assertive and start entering. After all, it's Natuna oil, gas fields to them and oil fields. And that is one thing that is part of the golden fulcrum. So it's not going to stay mute. It's already started being a little vocal. But of course, the maritime golden fulcrum has faltered in between it. You see how it goes by. Energy requirements of China and the US. The US has no per se energy requirements flowing through this, but China has. So therefore, China's Malacca dilemma, it's not only Malacca dilemma, it's also the Sambok and it's also the other states dilemma that takes place. So the issue is China is more worried about it. Now it may be building pipelines all over. It's got an existing pipeline from in Myanmar coming right up to Kunming side. Now it's looking at say the BRI or that pipeline there. But you must remember that these are overland and these are through national territories of other nations subject to the national laws, the vagaries of nature, one, and also any instability in those regions. So the sea lane is going to be the most. What one VLCC can deliver in one day is much more than any pipeline can deliver. There are limitations. So China has more worry about the energy security part of this. And therefore it is a major issue as far as its worries are concerned. It can look from anywhere. Even if you go through the Arctic, it's not going to be cost effective. So it's going to be mainly from the Malacca Strait to the Lombok and Sunda Strait.
Professor, is it different from the statistical concerns?
Oh, hold on. So we'll just go to next because we are running out of time. Yeah. Please, you can meet him after. Okay.
So there was two questions asked to me, and let me just answer this in as few words and as quickly as possible. In international relations, we often use the terms geopolitical and strategic interchangeably, but they're really quite different. Now, this question about India's stand on South China Sea. Our stand, I believe, is more geopolitical than it is strategic. Now, why do I say that? I say that because essentially we look at the South China Sea from an Indian Ocean lens. What matters for us really is that if China remains bogged down in the South China Sea, it will not be able to project power in the Indian Ocean region. Our domain of influence, our domain of interest in the Indian Ocean region. We don't really care what happens to the South China Sea, whether they are able to sort their differences out or not. Now, this is in the near term useful, this kind of an approach, but in the long term it's detrimental. The Modi government is being driven, I think, by three imperatives that should be known. One is a lot of trade is flowing across from the other side. Second, the Modi government somehow believes that if we have to position ourselves as a world power, we've got to take a stand on big issues. At least we seem to be taking a stand on big issues, regardless of what we really feel about them. And most importantly, this whole balance of power framework, in which China has we've got to play our game in a way that China continues to remain bogged down in the South China Sea. So I think what's going to happen in the future is that India is not going to take a very strong stand. This whole thing about the reset which is happening between Modi and Xi, the informal summit and all of this is all part of this whole hedging strategy on the part of India. At times you join the Quad, show that there's lots of activity happening in the Indo-Pacific region, we have interest in South China Sea, then you suddenly do a reset and then you go to China. Make sure that a Doklam doesn't happen again. We don't really care what's happening the other side. On the question of Indonesia, look, Indonesia was in charge, was the IORA chair for good 2 years. But really speaking, took no real initiative to cultivate any consensus. Because Indonesia is driven, like a lot of other states, I would say smaller middle powers, is driven by its own contingent interests. And the Indonesians were simply making the case that we need to have a framework of regionalism in which we can keep out the extra-regional costs. It does not make any sense. The reason it doesn't make any sense is because China is really, you really posit China against the US's military strength. And if you remove the US and other extra-regional powers that Indonesia puts it, you're not really getting anywhere. So I believe this whole global maritime fulcrum strategy, this whole, we are the sort of bridge between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, is basically about underscoring Indonesia's centrality to the Asia-Pacific domain. This is not about really sorting out the matter between all the claimant states. So I don't think Indonesia really is a very honest broker. I think this is just a little bit of posturing, and I think going into the future we need to look for other partners. Australia, I do think, is going to be a better partner to be with, because I think they are taking a strong stand on this. My final point is going to be this, and I'm going to leave it there. Look, there is a big dilemma that is facing a lot of these states in the Asia-Pacific region, and that dilemma is essentially called the abandonment dilemma on the one side, and second, the entrapment dilemma. So it basically means that we will support the big powers if you oppose China, if somehow you can oppose China and balance China. But we don't want to get entrapped into your particular nationalistic agenda. So we will be with the US. We are also making the same case to the US. We will support you in some ways. Don't get us involved into the South China Sea conflicts. As long as this dilemma is present, we will have difficulty in moving forward. So we will, again, as I said, need to look for a way in which we can have sharper policy choices. We know where our interests lie. I think we should forget about abandonment. The US is not abandoning anybody, as Captain Parmar has just said. I think they have treaty obligation, etc. I think they want to be a big dominant part of the region. We should be putting our eggs in the American basket rather than doing a reset with China. So I don't agree with the Modi government. I think we've got to think through how China's policy again. Thank you.
So thank you for so patiently answering all our questions. On behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, General Global University, I would like to take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to our esteemed panelists, Mr. Abhijit Singh, Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh, Dr. Swaran Singh, and Captain Sarabjit Singh Parmar for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. Your insights have truly given us something to think about, and we thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I would also like to thank Professor Kipling for graciously agreeing to moderate this discussion. I would like to extend our gratitude to the JGU events team, Ms. Swarnima Singh and Mr. Lalit Kumar, for helping us put up this interesting session. We would also like to thank our Dean, Dr. Sriram Jolle, for his continued support. And finally, I would like to thank the support staff, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. Also, to all the students and to everyone else who participated in this discussion, thank you. You have been a patient, engaging and wonderful audience. I would now request our panelists to join us for lunch. Thank you so much.
We'll take picture together.
Sure, sure. Thank you. Thank you. Excellent audience, some very fantastic questions. Very challenging questions.
Thank you very much. There's another number? No. Okay. So we'll take some pictures. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Right for the lunch. Where's Sabi? Sorry. Come on.
So,
Abhijit, let's take picture. Would I?
Come.
Where's the cameraman?
Is that?
Oh, okay.
Held by students.
Saima? Oh, okay. Join us.
So,
is it everybody here?
Devanshi, you want to write?